understand what he was hoping to theorize.
Daniel's.
Yeah, the number were, I don't know if all the articles, but some of the articles of the main conference on photography.
Oh, yeah, so yeah.
The room is open, isn't she?
Yeah.
Oh, she does. She's having a chat. Just to get down on the train, okay?
Yeah, it was. Today I caught the 10:03 from Houston, and it got in 20 minutes late.
That's not too bad.
No, it's because they can't go so fast on
Yeah, they are.
this time.
I think they've been pretty good. I'm actually impressed with London Midland Bridge instead of hating them.
I got to Victoria this morning, coming up again, and they wouldn't let us into the underground. So many people, so they shut the gates and let them go through, and then open the gates and let the next
Lock through.
Yeah. So that was fun.
So have you watched that program actually, like London Underground and how it runs?
Yeah, I did see one of them. Was it from a few years ago or recently?
It was. I think it was early last year that it came on, but yeah, it's so much that goes into it that you probably don't even comprehend when you're trying to get on with that. Not a job that I think I would want.
It's better than the New York subway system.
I've never been on that.
You don't want to.
Really? Just avoid at all costs.
Yes. Walk if you can. It's awful. Trains are falling apart.
It's also gives it character.
Not in sacrifice for my own safety.
No, maybe not. When did you go?
First year of my BA.
Ah.
That was what, 2000? During Christmas, so it was.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's pretty much cold.
Colder than here.
Yeah, well, yeah. Pretty snowing then as well, yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty damn cold.
Did you get home alright the other night?
Yeah.
let's say 5 minutes long, and my sister picked me up. I was like, yes, she's in town.
Results.
No horrible training.
There's I like the design of that book cover. I like the covers.
It's nice. That's thickness of matter.
Where's the camera?
I'm just going to go and possible to stiff I can in the office because I'm going to be shy.
My match seemed to be asking that. What Daniel said was that the Russians don't write philosophy books, they don't put philosophy in their literature.
Yeah, I can believe it. This has got this is the way back to the ground. This is a 15-page introduction to the fifth printing of what is Metaphysics.
That's it. It's a Heidegger.
Yeah.
That's copyright as well.
Oh, right. Yeah, I haven't got this digital signature thing.
You just literally type it. It's not like a...
Oh, really? You can't even say that.
I know,
Just,
sorry. It's
just
meant to
write,
be
just
fast,
type your name at the end.
It's
Baffled
fine.
by
It's
you
throwing
two.
lots of people. That's organisation, printing it.
Do you like the Auschwitz film?
Oh, I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, the seizure.
If you sent it last night, I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, I was wondering what like, the write-up that came about, like, how, like, if you saw it at the BFI, what further contextualisation you gave it?
It was.
I don't know.
It was there's a kind of a radical film collective based out of Edinburgh, I think, or Glasgow, called Kill Your Timid Notion, and ever so often they're invited down to London and do sort of filmings of sort of structural films, but they make a big splash, or a relatively big splash. So I mean, I saw that as a kind of 2-projector installation. Well, it wasn't an installation. It had a sort of start time. It wasn't just kind of going on. It was very much a kind of right. The film starts this time in the main cinema at BFI, but they also did this amazing projection of Michael Snow film in the IMAX, and it was just phenomenal. I no idea what the fuck it was about, but it appeared to be kind of like a camera going over the surface of some uncharted planet, you know, just a sort of surface. But when it's 3 stories high, you know, and it's like 1 o'clock in the morning, and the place was absolutely full, it was amazing, you know. I mean, it was far exceeded anything that the filmmaker could ever have imagined in terms of a diffusion of his own film. It was just brilliant. It's just kind of seeing structural film in those kind of contexts, you know, as large-scale public events on high kind of resolution diffusion equipment. It's just fantastic.
What do you call structural films?
What do I call them?
Yeah, what are structural films?
Well, structural films are films, effectively films made by the London Filmmakers Cooperative somewhere between 65 and 75, 80, non-narrative, referencing the material of film and its projection apparatus rather than too much
I'm
else.
philosophical, I think.
Yeah, you know, you could call it. I mean, it's called structural film because that was a sort of tendency, major sort of theme in the work. You know, it was film about film rather than about stories and narratives. But it didn't have to be. You know, nobody was saying, oh, you must do this, you must do that. You know, it was just the first time people were recognising that or already getting excited about the medium of film as art practice, you know, in the same way that, I don't know, you know, painting the act of painting sort of was only started being interrogated in the 50s, really, you know. Before that, you know, in the early part of the century, the process of representation started getting interrogated, but you know, it was people starting to interrogate film as a material, you know, and it concentrated in London filmmakers and cooperative.
Yeah, please.
And it also coincided with structuralist turn in philosophy and critical theory, which is sort of, you know, it's been sort of lumped in with that.
Okay then. So I just see this as us digging into Heidegger. I'm just making a start on Heidegger. Because some of us here, I think, know a little bit of Heidegger, and some of us know less. Grace and Dane, yeah? So how do we introduce Heidegger? Did anyone have a chance to glance at this, or did it all arrive too late?
Is this Is this what Mattia? Yeah, Mattia sent this link to this. Yes.
I just one, and I read
the first 59 pages.
the index, and it took me 3 hours.
Oh.
I spent 3 hours reading the index, but that might be a shortcut to the overview.
Okay, but that's what you asked for, wasn't it? You just said read.
Yeah.
No, not the index, the introduction.
Yeah, the preliminary.
I got about halfway through.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's start with that. So shall we start? Let's start with. So you can't really teach this stuff. That's the problem. You have to live it, really. It really is a way of being, you know. So this is already going to fail from start. You know, in a sense, we'd probably do better if we went for a walk around the museum or something to understand. But we'll try. Shall we start with the name? Did you see? Did you read that? Did you get to that for anyone?
No, I didn't. I was reading this, so I didn't get.
Start with the name.
Yeah, where does metaphysics get its name? How does it come into being, this metaphysics, which isn't obviously the original Greek, which is something like, could be translated as beyond physics, or that just means nature. So, metaphysics gets named Aristotle, because what Heidegger wants to do is to sort of get out of what he calls being. Get out of being means to go beyond being and beings, which is the purview in his mind of where tradition metaphysics has ended up, concerned with being and beings. To get out of being will be to go beyond the being and being into big B being, if I might put it like that. So metaphysics is always to do with beings as beings. So that's going to start. But the name, start with the name really, I think. Aristotle dies in about 2221 BC, 22 or 321 BC. By about 300 BC, he's old news, and he goes out of fashion until the 1st century. when the Greeks decide to pull his work together and make it available for the schools, the different philosophy schools that have grown up in Greece. So they start to collate their notes and everything they have on, or Aristotle's notes, his works from their libraries, and then they start to organise it according to the principles that have developed in the school. So they start putting it into logic, categorizing it under logic, under ethics, and under physics, which is how they, this is the school's philosophy, Greek philosophy, Greek school's philosophy. So they start to line up his work under that, and that all goes fine. There is logic there is stuff on nature there, and there's stuff on ethics, on how people act. And then there's something which Aristotle calls philosophizing proper philosophizing. And this is a bit of an embarrassment to them, because it doesn't fit to the Greeks. This is the Greek cataloguers, or whatever you want to call them, collators. This is a bit of an embarrassment, this philosophy proper, because it doesn't fit into the categories. It isn't logic, it isn't ethics, and it's not really a philosophy of physics, it's not philosophy of nature. Physics here, when you say nature, it means biology as well, and all the rest of it. So what they decide to do, they look and they see that this philosophizing proper, which has to do with the nature of being, so Aristotle's book on being is noticed to resemble the physics. There's similarities between that and his book on physics. So they decide to put it before or after physics. This is how the way you get eventually, it's not Greek obviously, but metaphysics means after physics, simply because it's put in the library after the section on physics, yeah? So what happens over time is that that's simply a technical understanding, a technical solution to a problem. What happens over time is the word metaphysics, as it were, starts to define what it is the subject is about. So whereas originally metaphysics just means a place on a shelf, basically, after physics, it starts to take on the characteristics of after physics as the content, as it were, after nature, let's put it like that, called physics nature. So if we think of that as central there, and just as to place this historically, if I'm going to the future that way, let's say, because I'm facing this way, if the future's that way, then traditional metaphysics takes its jumping off point, starting off point from that understanding of being beyond nature. And that leads us into the traditional understanding and everything that's confused about the nature of metaphysics. So modern understandings, your understanding of metaphysics, your simple understanding, can I put it like that, your simple understanding, because that's probably the most interesting, your naive understanding of metaphysics, yeah? I mean, in the traditional everyday common sense understanding of metaphysics, what kind of things does it entail? What kind of things get loaded onto this term metaphysics? How do you understand it, Dane and Grace? How do you, as somebody who's got actually something interesting to say? No offence to you three, but how do you understand metaphysics from this sort of from your common?
Well, I usually link it with like mysticism and science is often linked
exactly.
with that kind of other.
Yeah, which is what's happened. That's the beyond, isn't it? In philosophy, there's that whole supersensuous world of which becomes gods and all that kind of thing. As you say, the mysticism, that sense of beyond. Yeah, but this is all an accident, or not an accident, or it's all come about, as it were, out of a kind of misunderstanding, or well, how has it come about? However it's come about, it's come about. And there are signposts on the way of why this has happened. Thomas Aquinas reinterprets the metaphysics, the beyond nature, in terms of Christianity and God. So it becomes the supersensuous. Yeah, but now this is, we're going to jump back to Aristotle, the original understanding of it, because what metaphysics, or after nature, if you like, is the translation of the Greek. What the nature bit means to Aristotle is beings in their self-preservation, beings in general in their self-preservations, and being in their essence. So beings in their totality and beings in their essence. So the language in here is much better than how I'm putting it together. But basically, there's two lines of thinking to this. The second part of the work, the Greek word that gets translated as metaphysics, the physics part, in fact, the nature part, is nature. And that is the self-preserving. So beings in their self-preservation, in totality, and beings in their essence, is the two questions. So what happens, that's the original Aristotle understanding of metaphysics, beings in their totality, in their self-preserving totality, and in their essence, in their essential nature, preserving essential nature. What happens to these two questions on the other side of this thing, the metaphysical change, is the question of beings in their totality, what is common and general to all beings, and this is why it resembles physics, because that asks of nature in a slightly different way. So it asks what things are in their being and in their generality. This gets changed to being things. It points to the prime mover, as it were, because say if you take all beings and then you want to talk about them in their totality, but what also happens is that you, in asking metaphysical questions, you put yourself into the question because you're part of the totality. So a metaphysical question like what is finitude, or what is solidarity, or what is individuality, puts you into the question. So if the question is something general that all beings require and you answer with movement, then what happens is the question then becomes, well, what is the one, as it were, the one generality of movement, which becomes the prime mover, which then becomes God. But at first it's just called the divine by Aristotle. He doesn't have any religious ideology, any faith to shore up or back up, which is what happens with this. So things in their the original meaning of being in their beings, there's these two different directions, and this is where the problem lies, in these two different directions. In the relation between beings in their essence, their essential nature, and being in their totality. So these are all metaphysical questions because they deal with beings in their being. And beings in their beings, stretching on this question of things in their essential nature, becomes a question after science and logic and propositional truth. So the questions in traditional metaphysics are things like what is substance, and questions like this, questions about things that sort of will have more to do with the propositional logic of the known sciences, of the discourses of that logic. So when you get to read Identity and Difference, and he starts talking about the overwhelming arrival of big B being, as I'm going to keep calling it to make it more obvious what I'm talking about, the big being, the overwhelming arrival of big B being. This is being not as being, but being as in that which is common to all beings, but which they have no control, as it were, over.
This is design.
So the design is the existence within being, yeah, that's right.
And I always think it is very, very important with Heidegger to look at, there is also a footnote in here in the turning explaining the difference between Sein and Sein there. But it works, because in English it gets lost. We keep bouncing back and forth between being and being and being and being. if in Germany is Sein, and Sein is that which is, and this is to be infinitive, and this is one of us, one instance of to be. In Latin, it would have been esse, from which essence. It is direct link here. And then you in the Sein there is ente, on in Greek. So you have the same root going across in these languages, which in English, for some reason, we don't do. I mean, we could say be and then being, but we don't. And it becomes more difficult to understand it. It's just that it helps seeing it this way, you know what I'm saying? Because Heidegger plays a lot with this, than with the words he's using. You know?
Yeah, he changes words. I mean, techno doesn't mean in Greek what he makes it mean. Let's go back to density and difference. When he talks about overwhelming an arrival in beings, and then what he's talking about, what is it that overwhelms and arrives in big B being? This is what he's always trying to get to and questioning, and this is what we're going to fail to explain, because really it's lived. It is part of what you are already. It's already here. Big B being, as it were, it's the divine without the religious connotations. Let's put it like that. You know, if you go for a walk and you say, I'm just going for a walk, I'm going to think something, I'm going to thinking, as it were. You know, just to clear my head or to sort out my thoughts. You're not actually thinking about anything in particular. You know, you go for a walk, you come back, what have you been at? I've been for a walk, what have you been doing? I'll just think. But not thinking about anything in particular. So it kind of works, I think, slightly like the way that the dream work works, where it goes through, you know, you turn over what you've done in the day, in the dream work, in Freud's dream work. So I think this kind of thinking, which is a leap out of propositional thinking, out of representational thinking, is really just this kind of turning things over and orientating yourselves, but not in any kind of directly understandable engagement, but just a more sort of general understanding, and that is how I understand one of the ways that being, the big B being works. Especially when you realise that being and time, so time is a really important part of this big B being. It's one of the ways of access, or the only access to it. So things in the later part of the book, when he starts talking about attunement and things like profound boredom, which is how he goes on to describe metaphysics in one of his other books, Basic Right. The profound boredom is where you're slowing down. You have this kind of sensation of slowing down of time, don't you? But when something's boring, it just drags and drags and drags. But this, of course, isn't a clock understanding of time. It's you. It's right into, you know, you're going to start going to say it's right into your nature, things like this. But the problem with that kind of language is it already points to the representational thinking. You know, if you're going to start talking about nature, then you're going to come into the physics and that kind of logic and school of understanding. So, but the whole question is about trying to access this being, which he also oddly equates with kind of a light, you know, an illumination. That's in this little 15-page introduction to what is metaphysics. He starts talking about the way that it's the curiosities that make the subject fascinating or interesting. The fact that he's now equating big B being with this kind of a light, an illumination, or a change. We're going to call it a tune, not a change of consciousness, because consciousness is not the Dasein. The consciousness belongs, let's say, to the representational thinking. Consciousness plays along with, let's say, something like the categories of Kant. What Kant did was synthesize the necessary principles that you need to understand say, physical nature, so quantity, quality, relation, and modality, whether something's necessity or contingent or things like this. But those that categorical understanding of things is not the same as the Dasein's understanding, which is not categorical, but it does the same thing. It looks for the most general understanding that you can have for beings. So it actually jumps in and plunges straight in being in time with being in the world. It's like the first. You're thrown into the world. That's what he's saying. You're not a consciousness or a single I, like Hegel might say, which can extract it, extract, get itself out of the world, as it were, and be this single I unit, so fairly solid, which is a bit of a cartoon version of Hegel, because he's a philosopher of becoming, so nothing is that rigid. But there is a sort of understanding of the I, of consciousness. But in the Dasein is a version of the subject, or not a version, but a changed subject, which seeks after a different relation to the whole. Because remember, the being in metaphysics has a relation to the whole of being. It's always related to the whole, and it always puts you inside the equation. So this then is that side of what became, the schools, take our central point, what the school's understanding of metaphysics and where they put it in the library. The Aristotelian side, heading back to the pre-Socratic side, is different to what happens after it. So when you said, this, they've got this kind of mystical feel and all the rest of it, that's the traditional understanding that he wants to get out of, to go back to a more original understanding, which is more Heidegger, which is more in line with a sort of Aristotelian. He wants to go back to the roots, to scrape off what he calls the trivialization, the ambiguity, the mistake of understanding the metaphysics, which comes from understanding it as being a beyond. So it's either a beyond in the supersensuous sense, and that's suprasensuous or supersensuous, which is the world beyond this one as a kind of theological understanding, there's something beyond us, and it gets called a god or whatever. Or as Marx would say, the creation becomes the creator, and it becomes the gods and all this kind of thing. But that side, as it were, the pre-side, doesn't see the divine in this religious sense. It just sees it and then doesn't really explain it. It doesn't explain it. It just says that there's this kind of unseen element to our existence. And at the root of it is this thing he's going to call attunement. Attunement. Yeah.
In the text, there was a difference between Dasein, which they don't translate, and Dasein, hyphenated.
Yeah.
Is the Dasein the out there metaphysics?
I think he's just emphasising two different routes, because I think it's just used to emphasise in the text. So sometimes it's just the Dasein where you're plonked into existence, and then it means of being. So it's a bit more.
So it's not doesn't relate to the four-da kind of sort of.
Away.
Yeah, well, the gone there. The Freudian. I mean, the da meaning
not
there,
really
out
from
there.
It means being there or being here.
Or being here or being
not
there.
existing with dimensions. And
It means thrown into the world. It means, because in Being and Time, his big book, Heidegger's big his magnus opus, really, never really kind of beat it. He starts off straight away with that this idea that you're thrown into a world. Because, if you said, hence being in the world, and then there's being with others, and all these other being relationships that he goes through, being in the world, and at the root of your design and stuff is, or what is important to them is that, in design that you are gripped, you're thrown into the world, as it were, because that's one of the basic understandings that relates to yourself, that every being, as it were, is just here. Yeah, we're just here. That's it. You're here, being here, being there,
Seized.
being in the world. Yeah, you're seized.
Like
and that's
seizure.
and that's what he's saying. Yeah, that you have to be gripped, as it were. You have to be attacked. But it's problematic. It's the relationship to big B being. This is now the design is in it. The design sits within within beings, within big being. But you have to be gripped. You have to be attacked. You have to be moved. You're going to be buffeted, because it is the world of that which you're not in control. The world of nature, as we would translate it. But they would translate it as that which is self-preserving in itself, that which preserves it within itself. So.
It is being thrown into the world. The way we say it always, we are thrown into the world, we are that. It is the subject of the individual,
That's
us. Heidegger does not conceive of it as pre-existing. It doesn't conceive of it as separated. The subject is only in being, in the world.
But it's not subject, is it? I mean,
It's a small being, yeah. It's a form of, yeah.
So it's just there in the world, but it's gripped, and the gripped part is gripped by emotional feeling or attunement, yeah, right. So he's still looking for the most basic understanding, or the most general understanding of some things that are common to all being. So being gripped, that is, being engaged in the world. You're already engaged in the world. You come into the world sort of already formed, as it were. But being gripped, being attuned, the attunement part is that the emotional side. So being gripped, joy, grief, boredom. These are the things that he thinks that attune us, and all these are related to time. Can be understood as time. Happiness and joy, time just flies by. We say that, don't we? When you're enjoying yourself, time flies by. And when you're bored, it goes really slow, as it were. So that's how the big being sort of manifests. One of the ways that it can manifest itself. It's just that buffeting by life is the general big being.
You describe this as a pre-Socratic flavour of metaphysics, which is being revived by Heidegger.
Well, it's pre-Socratic, but it's kind of made. I think it's probably comes to fruition in Aristotle. So it's Aristotle that he's going back to look at. So
Aristotle is pre-Socratic.
No, it's post.
So which is he doing? He's reviving. It's a pre-Socratic.
He wants to go back to the more original understanding.
It's an Aristotelian
metaphysics.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he wants. So when what they did in the library, when they took his books and took what Aristotle called philosophizing proper, which is his book on metaphysics. Aristotle's book on metaphysics. And other works, but what Aristotle called philosophizing proper was this kind of embarrassment, because it's not logic, it's not nature, it's not ethics, it's this general trying to say things about after being in their most general principled way, in the same way that the same way that Kant has tried to do with categories to understand objects, quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Heidegger is going to try the same kind of technique, transcendental technique, to get to the basic, existentials is what he calls them. No, existentials, basic existentials, that allow you to relate to being, to get out of the metaphysics, the series of propositions that have to do with representational thinking. If it was Lacan, you could say it was the signifiers, or your commitment to a linguistic discourse, your commitment to a language game, if it was Wittgenstein. Yeah. So outside of that, he wants to sort of try and get back to, similar to the categories of Kant, the a priori necessity understanding principles that belong to your understanding of big B being, so being in the world. So care. And once he's loaded up the idea of being in the world, one of these principles, or the main principle that he thinks that he introduces is this notion of care, which really just means kind of like concern, being gripped again. You know, it means being. So you're in the throes of care or concern, and this has three elements. There's thrownness, facticity, and kind of authenticity that arise from this concern. So let's pick on Dane. There's Dane in his world. Yeah, Dane in his world. He's got his science and his logic stretched out before him over here. He's got all his answers. He knows the quantum mechanical understanding of the world and the mathematics, and he can write it down. Mathematics, by the way, is the modern form of metaphysics. We'll get back to that. So Dane knows this, but against that is those aspects that he has no control. The way that he flows through time, through space, through spatiality is another one another way that Heidegger sends his questioning, sort of philosophizing here, the kind of questioning. So he moves up through these different understandings, but being thrown into the world, you have your care, your concerns, you know, your family concerns, or this, that, and the other. But the care has to do with facticity, which is like your public face and how we understand you. I understand this, I could explain this like facticity. One of the ways to understand it is, if I was to say to you, Dane, sorry I'm picking on you, who's Sherlock, who's Conan Doyle? I mean, who's Conan Doyle? Grace, just, who was Conan Doyle? What would you say? He wrote Sherlock Holmes. That is what most people would say. If you say to most people, who's Sherlock Holmes, they would say, I'm sorry, if you say to most people, who's Conan Doyle, they would say, he's Sherlock Holmes. He wrote Sherlock Holmes, rather. That's his like face. He himself saw himself as a historical essayist. No one knows that. Conan Doyle, historical essayist? No, he's the bloke who wrote Sherlock Holmes. That's the facticity, if you like. That's the kind of face. Then the thrownness is the kind of projection into the future. You know, you're projecting your life. Because the thing about being, it all takes place in the present. The big B being, not little beings, but big B being. It all happens in the now. It all floods through everything. The cosmos, the whole of being goes through you now into this space. So that you take that now presence, or you know, what we talk about the aesthetic, which then would load onto the past as well, and project into the future. You know, your possibilities, your understanding, as it were, but not in this representational or quantifiable understanding. It's not hasn't got a telos in that in what Matt Barnaby just mentioned there. And then the facticity, the other part of it is for this care. Through care, you have care as this bit, you know, the principles or the existential of being in the world, thrownness, facticity, your face that you present to the world, and then there's authenticity or inauthenticity, or also, as it's translated, owned self or disowned self, and that has to do. He then introduces ideas to do with idle chatter and average everydayness in terms of language and discourse. Did you want to say something about this, Matthew? Because I know you're always fascinated by this question of authenticity and the own self. And
talked about it the other day.
No, you threw me off before saying that the subject is not really the way to approach this. It was going on in my brain now.
It's the Dasein.
Yeah.
So, yeah, to do with authenticity and the idle chapter, you know, the kind of average everydayness, it kind of speaks for itself. You know, when you just, I can use my family as an example, you know, they have no interest in anything that I do whatsoever. Absolutely haven't got an interest. And so our conversation is just this general chatter. You know, we never discuss anything like this. And that, and then with the newspaper and TV and that is how I understand the average everydays of idle chatter. And it's not a because it says idle. It's not like it's not being moralistic about it. That's just the way it is. That's the way that's the way we get it. But then there's another kind of own self or authentic self, you know, where you're not kind of sent with the flow, where you break with your kind of preconceived understandings, the way that you normally do things, that you break into it, that you think outside the box, as it were. You know, you take the representational structure and you leap out of it. So when we get back when we get around to doing identity and difference, and Johnny will talk about thinking, belonging together. Thinking and being belong in the same as belonging together. So thinking and being. So within the big B being, yeah, we talk about big being, a little bit metaphysics deals with being, but within the Dasein, within the big B being, he's going to say that belongs to a kind of thinking which has its own truth, which isn't the propositional representational kind. And he's going to say that this kind of thinking and being, is a thinking that belongs together. When the together is emphasised, you get the representational thinking together, and an identity and a sense of a kind of correspondence between what you say and the world. Back to that science, metaphysics, you know, the match-up, the propositional logic of science. But if the belonging is emphasised of thinking and being, the belonging together of thinking and being, just the belonging is the emphasised, then that is a different kind of thinking that he's trying to push us towards, which is not this representational, propositional, average, everyday understanding, but this leap out of metaphysics into a new kind of language, a new language.
Can I say that?
Yeah.
When he talks about language, you know, trying to leap out of language, does it mean like, you know, you just make up a language yourself? You still have to use, you know, English or whatever language you speak, but you can still be authentic in using that.
Yeah. Well, he means it like he thinks, you know, he says as a poet. If I do a poem about a rose or something, you know, it has its own truth. But the truth of the rose, as a rosacea that belongs to a family name and the whole thing, is a different kind of truth. You know, that's the catechal truth, which is would be perfectly at its root covered by Kant's categorical understanding. So you can never talk about those things without there being a quantity-quality relation and modality, which parts of the Kantian category is actually split into threes, but we can't go into that here. But this other kind of understanding, this other kind of truth, aletheia, is not the same as the representational logic. It can still be true. What I say about the rose, or a poem, or a piece of music, the way it moves you, that's true. You know, but it's not a propositional truth. You know? So the leap out of metaphysics into being, into Dasein.
It's phenomenological. He's doing phenomenological truth.
Who is?
Heidegger.
In the sense that he is part of the phenomenological movement, yeah, but he's also an existentialist. I mean, that's what he's going to be put in boxes that he would put in would be existential and phenomenology, but he doesn't really belong in either, or he does. You know, this is the essential ambiguity of this. This is an essential embarrassment of philosophy. But at the beginning of this book, if you read the beginning, he says, you know, philosophy is an embarrassment. It's not science. It's not a worldview. He says, it's not. You can't really equate it with art as such. So what is it? He says. So what is this ambiguous stuff? What is it that we're trying? What is it we're trying to do? And it turns out to be this questioning, and questioning after being, the big B being, this new light, as it were, that he would like to sort of change us. That's a new way of thinking and thinking in terms of totality. You always think of people in totality. It would be certainly a different way of thinking if you actually do that. You know, if you see people not, you know, it kind of pushes aside all the categories that you already have to describe people. Black, white, male, English, whatever it is, you know. Those kind of categorical performers are not part of a totality of being. No, not everyone's black or white or French or other. You know, none of that belongs to the totality of big B being. You know, the being or in its totality. And nothing like that has to do with the essence of anyone. You know, the fact you're French, you could be English, you could be German, you could be blue. You know, it doesn't matter. Those things don't matter. They're not part of his performance, as it were. So he's trying to make you think somewhere else, on the hoof, as it were, you know, and allow things to come towards you out of being, which you would only recognise, say, through the way they affect you in the attunement, how you feel, joy, grief, which are the big versions of them. But those things are already made up of little tiny versions. So think of a chord or a piece of music, you know? If I play the chord of A, I'm calling it A, but already within there, you've got E's and C sharp, a third and fifth, because all chords are major triads. So you just go into that, but then I just called an A, and then kind of particularized it into little A's and E's that make it up. Well, you can go into those little A's and E's and do the same again. Go into that little A, and there's further little A's and E's. Go into that, and there's further little A's and E's, and on it goes. This is the timbre question, thing to do with timbre. But those tiny, small print convictions added together make up that attunement, that feeling. But you're not necessarily going to be aware of them. You're not going to have any direct engagement. You're just going to be there. And all these, so you could think of that. Oh, just to jump into a bit of psychology here. In the same way that in psychology, things that take place as you know, the part objects, of desire, are real objects, but they don't have to link up in any straightforward kind of way. Freud tells a story, the Oedipus story, to tell a story of the psyche. But that's his favourite story. He knows that, and everyone else does. But there are other ways to tell the story. But the thing is, there's no direct link between what happens in the unconscious and how it manifests itself out here in the world. There can be a disjoint between the two. See what I mean? So there's the same thing that I think, similarly, maybe. And maybe this points to the Lacanian real and its relation to big B being. This notion that, you know, that there's something in Lacan called real. But I'm moving into Lacan now, and so I apologise for that. But it's just something to think about, you know, the Lacanian real and the big B being. What is the relation between the two, you know? Of course, one's psychology, the other one has to puts you in the picture, and one's that, you know, really is about you in the picture, yes.
One year we spoke, just before mentioning for Lacan, about all these elements or components or various instances of being there, Dasein, that create the tune. And then before you mentioned the truth of the poem about the rose, which is different than the propositional truth of saying this is a rose.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah.
So is this every word here is very delicate to use, but just to get there quickly, is this network of things that creates the attunement, the being there, that Heidegger is after?
No, he's not really kind of pursuing it in that sense. Mm-hmm. You see, the pursuit that you're talking about seems to be more like where we are now when we start talking about the technological age, which you know, the inframing, technology which challenges us to be standing reserve, which just means kind of potential, you know. So what you're talking about with, like, what you're already seeming to me, what you're pursuing, which is like one of those words, Herstellen, I think it was, one of those inframing words. I think it's pursuing was Herstellen. You're pursuing something through, you know, a network, an idea of a network.
I use network,
But that sounds too ordered, you see. The network, it sounds to me to be something that belongs to that ordering.
What I was liking a lot in what you said is that obviously the point about the rules as being true,
Yeah.
it obviously it's interesting to us because it refers to our more poetic and poetic way of inhabiting things rather than the pragmatic or economical way, which is the technological framing. But my question is, I don't want to name these coming together, these belonging together things, or better, let's use the word belonging that Heidegger uses. What all of a sudden I think might be the point is that is Heidegger, when he refers to something more authentic than the care, than the superficial chatter, is after, in one way or another, bringing to the fore, to the surface, these belonging. Is this what he calls the belonging and the authentic, or I am wrong?
I'm not quite sure. So, how do you mean?
There is the care, the
throne.
superficial chatter, the throwness, where we think that are important things, and we run after them daily. One of which, or the most important one of which, is as in the contemporary state of things, is the technological framing, which is basically considering everything ready for consumption.
Yeah.
Most importantly, ourselves.
Yeah. Everything ordered for readiness for use.
Yeah, standing reserve inventions. Now, it's the first time I hear it like this, but it sounds very, very interesting. What you said is that the belonging is this other sort of much more ephemeral, but not less strong way of things being together, belonging together, which though is silent, it's concealed, is in the word aletheia of truth, there is art negative and later sleep. It's so we don't see it, and what he wants to do is to bring this thing up.
It's to reveal the big B being, as it were, but because it always tries to, it conceals itself. Like I said, with the I want to use the example of the timbre. Can I use the example of timbre? Do you know what timbre is?
Yeah.
Yes, you do. I know you do.
Yeah.
In music, you see, this will try to explain what it is. In music, if you hit donk a bell in an A or 40 cycles a second, whatever, you can tell it's a bell, and if I do the same thing on a guitar or a cymbal or whatever, the same note, you can tell the difference from the same note on a flute or a violin because of what they call the overtones on the small print convictions, as it were, the small little tiny overtones to the pure sine wave, and that's what identifies the instrument. The thing is, though, the interesting thing is that I think about that as an example is that you can identify something through the sound, but you can never get to what's making that sound. I've had this argument with scientific types, and if you had an instrument that could take my voice and then mathematically alter it into someone else's voice, then you would have conquered the question of timbre. Because the timbre is these, like I said, these small preconvictions. If I've got a bell which is A, and I say it's already made up of other parts, it's already got E, so it's a C has no sharps and flats in its wave function, or a G's got an F sharp, and that's it. But if you donk an A and stuff, it already contains these other frequencies within it. So you then go into those other frequencies and then look into them, then they already contain smaller frequencies still, and then you could go into one of them and that's smaller. And you never get to the root, which is why when the guy from Stein...
You're confusing timbre with pitch, though.
No, timbre is what enables you to hear, to recognise the instrument for what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
So
what
the
the
timbre of a violin is different than one of a trumpet, the
Yeah.
trumpet and the one of a...
for the same note.
For the
Yeah,
same
and
note.
you can hear that. You, as people, can
Mhm.
hear the difference.
A machine
But
can.
you can't scientifically get there because they've tried. This is what Per Boulez at CAM and people like that. But the mathematical, this is what MIDI systems try to do and fail because they're useless, and digital tries to do and doesn't work. Because when we had the guy from Stein, it was this kind of musical institute in Holland, I can't remember the full title, but they make musical instruments or whatever. And I put this question to him and I said, you know, about this technology, he said, you know, the best technology is still actually a wax disc. You know, it still has, because it can produce more of these overtones, as it were. The digital cuts them off.
And I believe it
But
applies to photography.
trying to get to the point is you can hear the difference. As a person, you can tell a violin from a guitar from the same note. The ability to do that, right, cannot be represented properly. There's no mathematics that works. Johnny would hear would be at this moment, go, yeah, not yet, Mark. Yeah, just wait. You just wait, Mark.
But I think that the computer, like the complex computing, is doing that. Complex generative programming.
But the magical bit is, you see, that's the representational thinking. That's that. The magical bit is that we can do it without any. You know, we can just do it. The fact that you can do it. You know, you can differentiate, and some people can do it much better.
But that's only true, Mark, on a very, very limited palette, like musical instruments. I mean, the radio phone-in shows who they play on this, where they say, right, identify this sound, this noise, and they'll play a recording of something, and the only requirement is to identify by the person phoning in. And it's incredibly hard to do this because, yes, we can identify a violin but you're talking about a very, very tiny palette of orchestral instruments which we've grown accustomed to over the last 300 years. But after that, it becomes very, very hard indeed to identify. And I think Noel's right. I mean, it's just a complexity theory. What makes up the timbre is so complex that we actually don't have very good mechanisms.
To go back to the
computers
the relation to the metaphysics and the beyond physics, is that in the sensory world we can identify, but identity itself is not part of the sensuous. It's part of the non-sensuous. Things to do with identity and unity and difference are not part of the sensual, they're part of the asensual, as it were, the non-sensual, in the same way that the suprasensual was the world beyond this, and then in the modern metaphysics it's God or number, mathematics. On the other side of this non-sensual, you have the idea of unity and division and all the rest of it. That's also another part of the beyond metaphysics, beyond physics, is still part of that question of going beyond. So the difference and the differentiation. So when you say, you know, when you actually say this is that and the other, you do say, you speak it out. You speak out, oh, this is that and the other. That is not part of the sensory world which was already there. You've spoken out. And to go back to Aristotle's metaphysics, when the word that's going to become metaphysical, beyond nature, it says, in the Greek it says beyond nature, as it were, metaphysics. What after the self-preserving part, the physics part, the Greeks then had this idea of speaking out, the logos, the discourse. So they always spoke out the nature. So when you say this is a guitar, da 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 da, you're differentiating, right, something that's already in being, as it were, but you're differentiating, you're representing, as it were, you're representing. But you don't need to do that. You don't need to identify in that way, like what Barnaby says. You identify something. But at the same time, you can differentiate. I understand. You can differentiate without differentiating, as it were. You can differentiate without representing. You know. So in that way that you can negotiate your way around the world. I'm back over here in Big BB and as design. You can negotiate your way in the world without a representation or logic and stuff. It's like a dance. As you walk around the street, you don't collide with people.
So you can identify without being able to articulate why you can identify something.
Yeah, you don't have, and when I say identify, I mean it in a kind of, probably wrongly, but I mean it just in the sense of a series of loose signifiers, rather than a hard on, so if you're out there in the world, you don't bump into stuff, This is not thought about as I negotiate a crowd, as you negotiate your car, traffic and stuff like that. You're thinking about something else, maybe, but you can still do the thing, as it were, without going through the representational understanding. I'm engaged in doing something. It's the same as that walk. Go for a walk. I'm going to go for. I've been working all morning. My head's messed up. I'm going to go for a walk and think and clear it. Come back and you say, "Oh, so you've been walking. What did you think about?" Nothing in particular, but you've reorientated yourself, like the dream work. You thought things through. No, nothing specific's been worked out. You haven't come back and said solution solved. Representation, propositional logic. All you've done is gone for a walk and changed your mood, maybe. Re-energized.
I've never done that, unfortunately.
But I do. But the thing, what's interesting about that, I think, is that when you went to the beyond, remember the metaphysics, and then they put it in the library, and then the content gets dictated by the word, metaphysics, beyond physics, and then you have the supra-sensual, the gods and everything, the noumenal realm of Kantian. On the other side of that, you've got the non-sensuous world of identity, of differences, that you articulate. You bring those together, you, with your discourse and language, unite things together. You assemble, as it were. But then there's this other assembled world, the sensory world, where you can tell differences without speaking differences, if that makes sense. The world that you inhabit, that's the Dasein.
I've got to say, at this stage, I'm lost here.
Good, that's where we should be. That is where exactly where
I
we
want
should
to try.
be.
I want to try to if everybody just indulge me. I kind of started to get lost when. A long time ago, but when I understand that Heidegger, I was quite interested by this pre-Socratic Aristotelian.
Well, heading towards the pre-Socratic. The Greeks.
Yeah. I understand that he was going to kind of revive this, and I understand this kind of notion that there's these two kind of metaphysics.
Yeah.
One which was talking about the kind of
the modern,
out
traditional
there, including kind of God and
post first century.
And the other, which is one that Heidegger was interested in, which was intrinsic.
The more original
versions,
where
pre-originary condition,
where
and intrinsic.
It didn't get trivialized. It calls it trivialization, confused, and something else.
So it's a human condition.
He gives examples of this trivialization in the medieval through the scholastics, say through Thomas Aquinas, where remember I said that in the original, you had beings in their totality, in that all being, that's us, beings in our totality, in the generalization, and then beings in their essence. What happens is that in the Middle Ages, scholastics.
When you're talking about beings and being, I mean, in the text, it doesn't translate Dasein. Are you translating it, or are you using a different word?
No, Dasein just means being there.
It just means being there.
Yeah,
so
here. So here, there. It just.
So you're not translating. If you're not translating Dasein into being.
No. No, there are still beings. We're still beings.
Yeah,
but we're not there. Just to call you a being. Rather than Dasein. Dasein plonks you in the world of big B being and has certain relationships. Just calling you a being, I'm just extracting you from the Dasein, as it were. You're just a being.
Okay.
You're a Dasein as well.
So it's like two categories of Dasein. One is big B being and the other is small being.
No, neither of them are Dasein. Dasein lives within. Dasein is your being put into the being of the world. It's you're thrown. You just arrive in the world. That's what he's saying. You're not subject object. Don't start from consciousness set over against the world. You're thrown into this world with your family, your school, all of this. It's just kind of there. You're there. You're in England. You're born here. You're born there. You know,
That's
bonk.
being, but it's not Dasein.
That is
Dasein.
being, yeah, but that is also Dasein in the sense of an existence, but an existence has to be acted out through the care, throatness, facticity, That's
Okay.
just an existential movement. But as a being, just a little being, just as a being,
As a
also,
human.
yeah, as a human, yeah, I do.
And the big B, being and the little b being, do these relate to Dasein?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, because the Dasein is within the big B, the being, which is, you know, the totality of beings in their being. At the same time, it's beyond that metaphysical. Metaphysics only deals with beings. Big B being doesn't deal with metaphysics. It's the root of the beings. It's that unsaleable, concealed something that is the root of this. So when I was talking about the tombours, and it keeps going back into smaller and smaller, as an illustration of how your emotions get smaller and smaller, and there's no straightforward cause and effect to the mood. There's no cause and effect to why you're in thus moods. You know, you can be. You know, if someone hits you, you hurt, you might be angry, that kind of. Not talking about that. It's a more mysterious effect. Hence, these little tiny small bits that join together, assemble together to create the mood. Maybe. You know, you have joy, grief, and they all are related to certain events. But quite a lot of the time, when you're going through your existence, it's small print convictions.
So you're a compound.
Huh?
You're a compound.
So they're the concealed parts. Yeah, because the big being is concealed, and he's trying to make it revealed.
So wait, so the big B being is human, a human.
No, that's metaphysics. Beings as beings. To get out of that, to place yourself into being, you have to think of things in their totality and place yourself in it as well. So you're just one amongst all beings. That's the big totality of beings. But that is still a metaphysical, because it deals with beings. But those beings have as their ground big B being, the being, which is kind of going to be, you know, God up that side, or mathematics. In modern metaphysics, modern groundings of metaphysics is either going to be a God. So look at it again. You're a being, you're a being, you're a being, you're a being. I'm a being. Yeah, right. We're a being, and we're also designed.
all being.
Yeah, we're also a
Or
design.
big B. Is that, you said we're all beings.
You're all
Are we-
being,
Is that
yeah.
big B or little b?
Well, it's got to be
Or-
both,
Little
because
b.
you're a being,
it's-
but you're grounded in big B being, which is all of you taken together in your most general aspects, right? Which is still being, but heading towards big B being. It's after the most general understanding. So movement.
it's either-
Movement. Take movement. Yeah?
So Dasein
Move-
is big
movement.
B.
No.
Design is a condition, is a
Yeah.
relationship.
So if you take movement, yeah, as a condition of little being, as beings, yeah, all beings have to move. It's part of, you know, change, becoming. Everything has to become and change. All beings, you, and you, yeah, right. So they would say, what then? So that is something common to all being. What then is the one primal mover of all you beings? That side of the mistaken category, you know, the library thing, I'm just going to call it that, that side of the library, that prime mover through, what do I say? The scholastics, Aquinas. Through them, that prime mover, which in Aristotle is just called the divine without religious connotations, and exists as the concealed big being, is concealed, hidden, that prime mover that moves through all of us, you know, call it, bring in Hegel, call it spirit, bring in Lacan, call it what else, libido, whatever. That, whatever you want to call it, those are representational understandings, by the way. But that that moves through you, you know, that prime mover, that side of the library becomes God. But they've got an ideology. They take Aristotle and make the prime mover, the story of the prime mover, they anthropomorphisize it, or as Marx says, they make the creation, God's are created in the minds of men, and then the creation becomes the creator. That's then the difference. That's why he wants to go back. He wants to get away from this trivialization of metaphysics and its ambiguity and its mistakes that happen through history. Beyond the gods, in the really modern version of metaphysics, would be mathematics. Someone like Einstein was a mathematical realist.
The prime mover for Aristotle, and is what affects the Christianity and Heidegger wants to avoid, is static.
Yeah.
Everything moves because the prime mover it looks like the center of the universe in the depiction.
And this is
everything else moves around it, but the prime mover doesn't move.
And this is where
While for Heidegger, it's a relation. We both move.
And this
as small beings, present participles of the infinity of the verb to be, and verb to be. It's a constant. That's a feeling of belonging. You realize
so he's kind of
part
introducing a sort of radical conservatism, where he's attempting to dismiss kind of tropes in philosophy that have been existing since Socrates.
No, since the scholastics, really.
And how do the scholastics kind of temporally relate to?
Because they take Aristotle and they kind of make it into religious orthodoxy.
He wants to break away from
and the scholastics are when?
Middle Ages.
Middle Ages. And then they
Aquinas.
kind of end with Descartes, although he's still one of them, because he still takes Descartes with the new science creates a subject-object paradigm, which again Heidegger is reacting against. That the Dasein is not a subject-object. But this idea of the prime mover as the causality becomes this real driving force. So all of science looks for causes. It looks for the causes for something. So this is going to become cause. So of course the God, the anthropologicalization of is a kind of safe bet, safe answer. It's a God that creates all this, rather than living with uncertainty. Again, that gives a cause to everything. Everything is moved through gods, or however you understand the gods. But that's the first cause. That's like the Big Bang, as it were, that sets the beings in motion. Dane looks like he wants to speak.
Well, I mean, there was, I can't remember which one it was, but when he talks about transparency, he was interested in the transparency of the world, the everydayness, where, his famous hammering nails. When you're hammering a nail, everything is completely transparent. There's nothing there, you don't see the hammer or the nail.
That's right.
And the only thing...
It's concealed, isn't it?
But only when there's a problem does things
they
take on an opacity.
Yeah.
They're not transparent anymore. And then it's a problem, and Heidegger is saying that philosophy has been dominated by the opacity. What happens when there's a problem where it should be taking on the transparent, because that's where
exactly
the important thing is.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
It takes away all
repeat that?
individual agencies.
Pardon?
It takes away all individual agencies. Has solid conclusions. You said particular.
Well, no, like Dane said, if you problematise that landscape, the traditional landscape, post-library.
Well, can we run out at a time? Because I can't, do you want to do that and then do that?
Sorry. Sorry, Lauren.
So, where did I get
You
to?
were repeating.
See, it's come opaque to me now.
It was transparency and opaque.
Yeah. So, well, if you're typing on a keyboard, you don't think about, I've got to press this letter and this letter, but and if you do, if there's a key that's out of place, you just think, it's a problem. You notice it. You're not in the world anymore. You're dealing with this problem outside of the world. So, and Heidegger's like, this is wrong. This is the important thing.
So he tries to problematise that traditional understanding, therefore hoping that big B being, this overwhelming arrival that you're plugged into, the world as such, the cosmos as such, will make itself manifest.
So he wants to. So there's he's trying to abolish, or wants to move away from a subject-object paradigm, where concepts are an object that is effectively an extrinsic object. So he wants to kind of have
problemise that world.
Pre-originary thought, pre-originary to conceptual conceptual
Well, he
form.
just wants to, yeah, to not. You can't bring back Aristotle. You can't back the Greeks. We're not Greeks. We're not in that world. We're not ready to hand. We would break that world because we would collide into it, and both worlds would probably break. But yeah, that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to get us to get out of metaphysics, which deals with beings, by problematizing that representational world, that ready-to-hand world, that immediacy, the immediacy of that world. And by making it problematic, it should somehow shine a new light. Being.
I don't understand how you use the word immediate there. I mean, I would have thought that it was precisely not.
No,
That it was mediated. It was mediated by its conceptual. Let's go back to the keyboard there. It's, you know, if you can type or drive, for instance, then
Yeah.
you have, through experience, learnt spatial arrangements,
Yeah.
and without conceptually.
But there's nothing wrong with saying that the immediacy is mediated. You've learned to drive, but once you've learned to drive, as I said, you know, you're doing it almost. You might
But it is
automatic pilot.
yeah, I know, because you've learnt it and it's happening in a different part of your brain.
Yeah.
And there's there's an immediacy to it, which if you think conceptually about the way it's the cue and stuff like this, then all sort of starts to kind of fall apart.
Yeah.
Or rather, the fluency is lost rather than the falling apart. But that it's the navigation, the kind of instinctual, intrinsic navigation, which is preconceptual, or
Attunement.
which is an attunement.
Your moods.
But I don't see how that. I would say that isn't far more immediate than the objective conceptual self, not self. The objective conceptual, extrinsic, metaphysical.
I think the problem is
Post-Socratic
with the language.
thing.
Immediacy is not a Heideggerian word.
Okay, all right, okay.
You know,
Move on from that.
so that is exactly what he was. That is exactly the kind of thing that he would say. Yeah, you know, you're using these words and you've got in trouble with them. You know, leap out, and then that's why he uses this strange. And it is a difficult. I think it's a difficult language to get. You know, the phrases are quite difficult.
But there is also a game that precisely because we're speaking about getting attuned with how things somehow, rather crudely, really are, not in depth, but how they relate to each other. I find very interesting the logic of his arguments, where he says something and then what he wants us to do is to revisit it in a different light. That is, it remains the same thing. But when he speaks about technology, in the essay about technology, he's not saying that the real technology is something else. It remains what he has seen in the first place, but it's just experienced in a different way. Is this correct?
Yeah, I think
So there is a continuous, the overwhelming experience of what he calls the arrival of Big Being, this moment of enlightenment, of the intuition of
Yeah.
enlightenment, is not revealing any secret truth that we don't have here now already. We just, it's like realizing, oh yes, this is my life now. I've been with you for quite a few years, see you weekly, we discuss these fun things, and this is who I am. It's when things get into place, creating a new sort of. But this is why I used the word
Yeah.
network earlier.
But at the same time, you know, you sort of sound like it's talking within beings. We always have to, there's always this two, you see, we say beings, but there's always big B being is the root of it. You know? So whenever you're talking about beings, it still has the big B being there, but it's just concealed most of the time. That's what he's saying.
Even when it comes to the four, it's not another presence here. It is the being together, the belonging
Yeah.
together of this situation. You know, when you're looking at something or you're listening to something and you're trying to understand it and you can't, it sounds like a mix of nonsensical sounds. And what do? You pay attention. And paying attention is an open attitude. You're not concentrating, you're not active, you're not propositional in any way. You're just open. And at a certain point, what did make sense? Makes sense. I believe he's proposing something similar in finding out the relation between the small instances of existence as a whole, which is being with a capital B, and us, being as with small b, present participles of that infinity. I never called it transcendental, I think, and I don't know if one can call big B transcendental. But,
how about
He's finding out the relationship.
how about he's within a kind of existentialist model. He's looking at the condition of existence. I'm deliberately changing the terminology, and seeing it as existence as a phenomenon, and that introjection of a temporal basis allows a space for self-reflection that then doesn't involve the necessity to look to the skies and the heavens. That it's, I mean, all these things of that are of interest and that are pertinent, like in particular attunement. You know, these are things which are, if you like, he's looking at the mechanics of existence, if you like, even the biomechanics. But of course, these things can only be considered within a phenomenological, i.e., sort of temporal thing. It's like, yes, okay, I'm human, but I don't exist like that. I exist like that, and sometimes I'm getting bored, and sometimes I'm getting angry, and sometimes I'm getting joyful. And but it's always happening over it. I'm experiencing it over a period of time.
And you see, that's where it points back to that original understanding of being, the Aristotelian. That it's that preserving, self-preserving. I'll read you the exact phrase for what he says there. So, the Greek metaphysics. Oh, it's just page 25. So the Greek word for what we'll translate as metaphysics. So the first part would be translated as meta, and the second bit as physics or after nature or something like that. He says it's the will you read it, Mattia? You got 25?
Yeah. Paragraph 8.
Yeah, just go to the bottom of the page from there.
We shall now translate physics.
Pardon?
The last paragraph. We shall now translate physics.
Yeah, and see what you can do with the Greek words. That
Physics, physical physics.
Yeah,
Is this not? We're not.
The word metaphysics.
I
Okay,
think,
right,
yeah.
alright.
Subparagraph 8. Elucidation of the word physical physics as the sub-form.
Oh, hang on. Where are you?
Page 25.
Just under the A.
But 25 is not the PDF page, it's the printed page. Because
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3.
Right, yeah. The A brackets to the heading bottom.
Yes.
Yeah.
Elucidation of the word.
Yeah, or just before that.
Okay, the word metaphysics, the meaning of physical. The word metaphysics, to put it negatively at first, is not a primal word, but a primal word we understand. By a primal word we understand one that has been formed out of an essential and original human experience as the enunciation of that experience. Here it is not necessary for this primal word also to have arisen from some primal time or zeit. It can be relatively late. The relatively late character of a primal word does not speak against its being a primal word. The expression metaphysics, however, although we wish to designate something proper and authentic by it, is not a primal word. It goes back to the Greek wording which reads, when broken down, metaphysica, or to put it in full, ta metaphysica, the things after the physics. We shall neatly leave untranslated this wording, which later became amalgamated into the expression metaphysics. We shall note merely that it serves to designate philosophy. Elucidation of the word physical physics as the self-forming prevailing of beings as a whole. We shall begin our elucidation of the context of the word with the last mentioned term, physical. In it lies physis, which we customarily translate as nature. This word itself comes from the Latin natura, nasci, to be born, to arise, to grow. This is also the fundamental meaning of the Greek physis, physi. Physis means that which is growing, growth, that which has itself grown into such growth. We here take growth and growing, however, in the quite elementary and broad sense in which it erupts in the primal experience of man. Growth not only of plant and animal, their arising and passing away taken merely as an isolated process, but growth as these occurring in the midst of and permeated by the changing of the seasons, in the midst of the alternation of day and night, in the midst of wandering of the stars, of storms and weather and the raging of the elements. Growing is all these taken together as one. Sounds almost like becoming, isn't it? We shall now translate physis more clearly and closer to the originally intended sense, not so much by growth, but by the self-forming prevailing of beings as a whole. Nature is not, for instance, to be taken in the narrow present-day sense of the object of natural science. Yet neither it is to be taken in a broad pre-scientific sense, nor in Goethe's sense. Rather, this physis, this prevailing of being as a whole, is experienced by man just as immediately and entwined with things in its Rather, this physis, this prevailing of being as a whole, is experienced by man just as immediately and entwined with things in himself and in those who are like him, those who are with him in this way. It's not the right way of reading this sentence, but I can't get the right meaning.
Which sentence?
Rather, this physis, this prevailing of being as a whole, is experienced by man just as immediately and entwined
with things in
with
himself
things,
and
with things
in those who are like him.
in those who are like him, those who are with him in his way. The events which man experiences in himself, procreation, birth, childhood, maturing, age, and death, are not events in the narrow present-day sense of a specifically biological process of nature. Rather, they belong to the general prevailing of beings, which comprehends within itself human fate and its history. We must bring this quite broad concept of physis closer to us in order to understand this word in that meaning in which the philosophers of antiquity used it, who are wrongly called philosophers of nature. Physis means this whole prevailing that prevails through man himself, a prevailing that it does not have proper power over, but which precisely prevails through and around him, man, who has always already spoken out about this. So you see that this is the movement of revisiting the same, to reveal it as the same. Whatever he understands, however enigmatic and obscure it might be to him in its details, he understands it. It nears him, sustains and overwhelms him as that which is. Physis, that which prevails, being as a whole, physis, that which prevails, beings as a whole, yes. I emphasize once more that physis, as being as a whole, is not bent in the modern late sense of nature, as the conceptual counterpart to history, for instance. Rather, it is intended more originally than both of these concepts, in an originally meaning which, prior to nature and history, encompasses both, and even in a certain way includes divine beings. So,
So you get all that stuff about procreation, birth. That's putting us in the picture. We're all born, we all die. You know, that's into the picture of being, metaphysics. But they're like the branches of a tree. The roots are big being, and they are concealed. But what drives it? You see, you might say, why is there something rather than nothing? You know.
But this prevailing.
Yeah.
I mean, it reminds me perhaps of Nietzsche's will to power.
yeah,
No,
I
don't think so.
there is that. It helps thinking of something parallel to this concept of physis. For the Greeks is speaking about, physis with all these sets of ways of being, which now we might call natural laws, but which included the order of things as it was known to society, to culture at the time. These list of things. Oh, shut up. Being consent, procreation, birth, childhood, maturing, blah 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 blah. What we might understand as the natural order of things.
Hold. Grace, do you want to see this? Sorry.
Hello. I'm afraid she's not at the moment. She should be back in about 3 hours. Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Sorry.
This natural order of things was something that wasn't sacred, but it had to be respected to the point that going against it was called hubris, arrogance. Wanting to understand more was required, wanting to understand beyond this balance, this net of belonging.
So no growth. Growth was hubristic.
Growth as in
The growth that he used there, I mean...
no, he speaks of nature as growing, but wanting to break down
That's
into
the Greek
rational...
version, that's the Greek, him explaining the Greek.
Yeah.
Not him.
Okay.
Going
I
to-
see, right.
Trying to break down this natural growth that happens along its own patterns and lines into concepts, representations, moments, understanding, pushing it more economically in one direction was heuristic and was to be condemned. So this is where it is moving from, as something that has a flow, as you said earlier, a flow of its own, and to which we belong. So we have a flow of our own altogether. Does it make sense? Is it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think what he's describing there is the roots and the branches, and the big B being is the underside of that which drives it, but it remains concealed. And then, but he's not. He doesn't want to go through the whole scholastic understanding of metaphysics, the conflation of philosophy with theology, things like that. So he thinks that's a mistake. Pardon?
Sorry, I was just trying to get a word in edgeface.
Yes, Laura.
Can I say something?
Okay.
I think, I'm thinking, well, what he needs to be doing is like, so the Dasein, like it's really sort of bringing in, that's really like an event, and it's like the dispossession, sorry, in the Itard. But on the other hand, because it's still in this sort of being and a big being, he's still reinstalling, he's not getting out of representation, he's still reinstalling identity and difference, instead of like with event, the learners on the Itard do, they bring in differences of differences and like the immersive economy, whereas he is sort of making this move with the Dasein, which is like referencing event or dispossession, Freud's energetics, primary process, but he's still like reinstalling a kind of a ground with this authenticity, instead of like differences of differences.
Well, no, because the difference between big B being and beings and authenticity belongs to the world of metaphysics and beings. You know, it's our relation, so it's still within beings. It's still rooted.
Oh no, big B being is in front of, Dasein is behind a big B being, concealed.
No.
I still haven't quite got the explanation between like, and I understand sort of the being that's being like talked about in relation to the scientific old science, not contemporary science, and then this split with the understand sort of big being he's talking about in terms of like what he calls fundamental attunement. But I haven't read the Dasein sections yet. Still not quite getting.
For me, it is something like understanding that once we have the gerund being, which is a present participle, one needs to leave it as being and go about one's day normally, but at the same time being able to feel, not to think in the new Heideggerian way, which is more is attunement, that there is this element of be, to be, which is nowhere to be grasped directly. But since you mentioned identity and different, it's always there as different, but as part of the identity or grounded the identity. And this is back and forth that Heidegger is after.
Yeah, but back and forth, like, it seems as if
The back and
it's
forth.
like an A and a B back and forth. Rather
No,
than
it's not an A and a B, because the B, it's not the BAD, but what it tries to get to go away is to experience this without a grammar, without thinking, oh, my verb to be has a root which then unfolds in all these specific options which exist as separated and applied to all these roots. You have to somehow, it's very mystical in this sense, you want to feel it. You want to be enlightened by it.
you can only experience it really. It's not an intellectual. Well, it is an intellectual thing, but it's an experience as well.
You can't be just by solely thinking you've got to
What is
be in
experience?
the world.
Sorry.
Yeah, but this is exactly
It's
an art piece work.
If it's experience, it makes it subjective in a way. So it kind of brings back, that's why I probably reject phenomenology. 'Cause it brings
Except he
back
doesn't want to
perception.
use that language. He wants to get out of that language game that you want to play. You can say it's subjective, but then you're just equating something that he doesn't want to equate it with. It's not the same. Design is not the subject. It's not subjective. It's a different positioning. You know, if you want to stay with the subject, you stay with Kant or someone, and that will give you access to objects and things. But this is that trying to access something else. It's an illumination or whatever. Shall we just jump it up into the modern metaphysics? Page 54. Bottom of page 54, Mattia, please. Can you do that?
54, yes.
What is?
What is the fundamental truth of modern physics?
Oh,
A million pound question.
Or shall we just go from the paragraph before?
In order to avoid.
Yeah, okay. Try that.
In order to avoid misinterpretations and at the same time to prepare for later discussion, I shall briefly discuss the fundamental character of modern metaphysics. Whenever we attempt to characterize modern philosophy, as we have done for antiquity and the Middle Ages,
No, we've got it through.
okay, the Middle Ages, we are faced with the fact that the concept of metaphysics has become fixed, but that nevertheless something new is occurring. If whatever is new is something that belongs to metaphysics and not to so-called epistemology, then we must ask, what metaphysical character does whatever is new what metaphysical character does whatever is new and which begins with modern philosophy have with respect to metaphysics in general? You can see from these questions that we ought already to have the living problematic of metaphysics in our possession, whereas for the time being we can state merely the following in the form of an assertion. Metaphysical thinking is comprehensive questioning in a dual sense, because it asks concerning beings as a whole, and because the questioner himself is always conceptually included among these beings. That beings as a whole are asked about in antiquity, as in medieval philosophy, may have become more or less clear. Much less certain, indeed virtually unintelligible by contrast, is the second point, namely how, in ancient philosophy, the one who is questioning metaphysically is himself put into question by this questioning. Yet it is precisely this point, the fact that comprehensive questioning conceptually includes the questioner, that gives us the possibility of understanding what is new in modern metaphysics in terms of its metaphysical content. What is the fundamental trait of modern metaphysics? Modern metaphysics is determined by the fact that the entirety of the traditional problematics comes under the aspect of a new science, which is represented by mathematical natural science. The less explicit train of thought is this: if metaphysics asks concerning the first causes, concerning the most general and highest meaning of beings, in short, concerning what is highest, ultimate and supreme, then this kind of knowing must be commensurate with that what is asked about. Then this kind of knowing must be commensurate with that it is asked about. Yet that means it must itself be absolutely certain. Thus, via the guiding thread of the mathematical idea of knowledge, the entire problematic of traditional metaphysics assumes the task of carrying out this demand in the strict sense, and thus also of phrasing metaphysics, understood in terms of its content, to the formal level of an absolute science. The problem of absolute certainty is above all the fundamental problem of modern philosophy, not in the sense of an epistemology, but sustained and guided by the problem of the content of metaphysics itself. We see this most clearly at the place where modern philosophy explicitly begins, in the Ska, but especially in Fichte. Fichte's main work bears the title Science of Knowledge, Wissenschaft. is that science, which has knowledge in the absolute sense as its subject, and thereby grounds metaphysics. The development of modern metaphysics is sustained by this priority of the problem of certainty with a view to metaphysical knowledge. From there, the modification of the body of problems and disciplines occurs. Yet, whenever we take things in this way, we do not yet have a proper understanding of what is happening in this concern for absolute certainty in metaphysics. What is ultimate but also be capable of being known in the ultimate sense. Yet, what is the status of the concerns of metaphysics for an ultimate certainty? It always tends to be pointed out as particular characteristic of modernity since Descartes. No longer starts from the existence of God or from proofs of God, but from consciousness, from the I. We can see that the I, consciousness, reason, person, spirit, indeed stands at the center of the problematic. If we heed this fact and ask whether this central position of the I, of the self-consciousness, does not in the end express the fact that in modern philosophy the questioning I is also put into question, then we must say, this is indeed the case, yet in a peculiar way, for the I, consciousness, the person, is taken into metaphysics in such a way that this I is precisely not put in question. This does not mean a simple failure to put into question, but rather the I or consciousness is precisely placed at the basis as the most secure and questionable foundation of this metaphysics. So that in modern metaphysics, a quite specific, comprehensive questioning manifests itself. An inclusive comprehending of the questioner in the negative sense, in such a way that the I itself becomes the foundation of all further questioning. Here we find the innermost connection between the priority of the problem of the subject and of the question of certainty, and the question concerning the content of traditional metaphysics. This might suffice on the one hand to show that the different nature of modern metaphysics, and on the other hand, in order to make it clear that this concern for ultimate certainty and the orientation toward the I and consciousness is meaningful only if the whole problematic is entirely maintained, so much as regard for our historical orientation. It makes me think of what we were reading before Christmas in the Lyotard, just to help explain a bit this discussion about the grounding metaphysics on the solidity of the I, of the subject, in Descartes.
In Descartes.
In Descartes, as the root of modern metaphysics.
Because he doubted everything except himself.
So that became the ground. When halfway through Discourse Figure, Lyotard quotes, or better refers to, a work of art history which was written in the mid-60s, which is an analysis of, the title is Figurative Space Between Renaissance and Cubism. And it's an analysis of how space is understood through perspective, or better projected to perspective, grasped as such. So creating a stage, pure stage with pure dimensions, upon which the events of the painting, but also the events of real life happen. So the two things are separated. And obviously, because it is organized by perspective, it requires the eye of the eye to be in place. So it is a visual translation of Descartes' subject. And it says this is the same argument, I think. Right? It says we have to keep this in mind if we want to engage with modern.
He wants to problematize, as Dane was saying, that which
that
was just taken
in
on
place,
step from Descartes all the way through to idealism. The I is not problematized until you get to really Kant and Hegel. Like this. I wanted to break up on the mathematics as the metaphysics of mathematics, because if you Einstein was a mathematical realist. He believed that the world was mathematical. That the answers would all be mathematical. Now, there's two camps in science. There's those mathematical realists, and there's the more sceptical ones. It doesn't really matter because they both engage in the same kind of science, the same kind of observation, the same kind of methodology. They just have a different telos, as it were. One wants to see, one believes, rather that the world can be, is numbers basically. But then this is where I think, this is where I understand my quantum mechanics in relation to these metaphysical questions is that on the other side of the argument of the mathematical realist is really saying, where there's problems, Bell's theorem and the entangling of particles. So against the mathematical realists or the physical realists, they would say, look, that's great, if you want to believe in a mathematical realism, that's fine, keep looking for it, but there's a problem, and it's Bell's theorem, where basically interacting, entangling particles either they break the speed of light, or they're not really two. What we think of as two particles may very well be joined somewhere. But at the moment, they seem to do something. They signal each other. If you have it's in the, I think you find this in some of these books that you're reading, Barnaby, Griffith books. You have particles that decay and go off in opposite directions. They measure one, they measure the other. You know this, yeah. And they know that the signal between them, they somehow seem to be in touch. But the problem is, to be in touch would be faster than the speed of light. So there's a problem. And this is the problem of Bell's theorem and entangling theories in quantum mechanics, yeah, which breaks with the mathematical realists. That's the problem. That's the speculative, argument, that it breaks with mathematical. But as again, it doesn't really matter, because both sides of the argument, they're just speculating. But they both go about their business in the same way. They still observe X, and if you do Y, then P is the result, and that's how they both do that. So whatever the long-term result is. But they still
don't sort of say that everything can be predicted.
No, I use the mathematics, physics. Einstein is a mathematical realist. He said God doesn't play dice or something like this. Just that's a specific position from him and his people like that. They know that's what they're arguing for. But then the reality is that there is a problem. Before the actual physical proof, Bell's theorem of entanglement was just a theory like any others, but it came about in more recent decades that there is actual this physical effect can be measured. This entangling of particles, this breaking of the law of relativity. Is it breaking? Yeah, it breaks the speed of light, and you can't do that. You can't break the speed of light. That's the limit. That's the law. So there's something else going on. Therefore, they have to find out what that is.
But in which way it is not simply a new question that challenges the older theory, and instead it challenges the old mathematical realistic.
Yeah, but to get back, why the example is more because it's this question of certainty that's crept into the metaphysical question after the library, through the tradition, and not the sort of the Aristotelian thing. The question of certainty through this question of cause. So the question about the prime mover again, and the causality of things becomes this all important. And when you were reading with the Descartes, his big thing was clear ideas, wasn't it? It was clear and concise ideas and thinking. This question for certainty then becomes part of the metaphysical orthodoxy. Same with religion and stuff, which is to do with faith. It's a bit more complicated, but it's to do certainty has crept in. Again, that's what Heidegger is challenging, that orthodoxy. Again, I know it's silly. My example of the rose and the truth of what I speak in the rose. It's not this is a rose. Blah blah blah. It has so many sepals and whatever and all the rest of it. That kind of truth is a different kind of truth that speaks a different kind of truth. So once again, he's questioning. He wants to problematize the whole understanding of certainty, which of course we've just done with our entangling particles. That kind of thing. So, but there is this modern understanding, this modern grounding to metaphysics, which still remains at the end of the day, as he says, problem is ambiguous, problem, and that's great. That's what he says. It should be an embarrassment. You should fail, because in a way, you know, it's not just the language, is it? It's the being of it. It's the inhabiting of it somehow.
But it's not just language.
It's allowing it to emerge. As like I said, you know, we probably discovered more of being across the road around the museum than sitting here discussing, or rather sitting here and both. You know, when you leave here, you know, that's when you sort of engage properly with the question of being,
Yeah,
as it were.
well, one of the interesting things now is this. Well, people still are arguing whether it's just like a case of like we don't have enough information, and so like enough data, so that's why we can't
Yeah.
sort of be predicted. And that's very different from saying, well, actually, there's a causality which doesn't relate to sort of not having enough data. It
Yeah.
relates to event, and this is the event that Heidegger is bringing in with his star sign, and why it's so critical. It's a really much more critical kind of event.
Yeah,
Because it brings the new, and it's not reducible.
Yeah, and that's just trying to say with the psychology as well, that, you know, the primal cause in the unconscious or whatever, and the way it manifests itself, there doesn't have to be a direct any link. That's what the condensation and displacement is all about. But there's even more condensation and displacement than just condensation. Is it condensation? Yeah, it's condensation and displacement. You know, when the item of desire is displaced onto something else, or various ideas are brought together into one place, that kind of condensation displacement. So the deep roots, the object are, or is the signifier in the Lacanian, in certain aspects of the Lacanian understanding, and how it manifests it. There is that break, which is what you're saying. But what's happened? There's a question for certainty, which comes out of that inframing of the technology, which orders us, or as it were, challenges us to be ordered, you know, into standing reserve, to be potential, you know, to be ready, engaged, but in a certain specific way. Did you anyone see the thing I dropped into Dropbox about people? Did you see that? The thing about did it arrive? If I just stick something in Dropbox, I don't know if you don't get it. I'm not sure how
But
you
did you also
No, I just dropped it in.
You didn't tell anybody you'd done it.
But basically, the thing I dropped, it's from Serbia, these people from Serbia, these doctors and professors, talking about managerial discourse.
Oh yes, you did send an email about that, but it was a bit obscure,
yeah.
yes.
Not an email, I put an article in. The thing is, what I'm saying about this is that this is the prevailing language that starts to conquer. Never mind your postmodern minor languages and the rest of it. You know, management speak is the lingua franca. Is that what I mean when I say lingua franca? It's the universal language. So these people from Serbia were discussing the way their socialist country, after the wall came down, where everything was in the first person, there was talking to the worker, and everything was a contract, is now become employers and human resources. This language change of language discourse. That is part of, I understand it, that's part of the inframing, the challenging that technology does. It challenges us to be standard. So if you can universalise, so these Serbian, these Yugoslavian countries, suddenly found themselves speaking a language, managerial language discourse, which transcends their other boundaries, the other boundaries of language. But I'm just saying that this is part, to my understanding, of that whole technological challenge, part of ordering you to be useful standing reserve. Management speak, as I think.
But Heidegger doesn't seem, unless I did not understand it in the end, doesn't seem to indicate, or even to want to indicate, another option.
It doesn't offer solutions.
But it doesn't even say that another solution is needed. It just wants to somehow to create an attitude when one can become aware is not the right word, one can recognize that this is taking place. And that if anything, the understanding of the belonging with being, and the relation of the small beings, us, with the bigger being, happens in language. This is what
it does. Yeah.
or in art, in other cases,
Yeah.
it's more generous and goes
Yeah.
beyond poetry.
There's a kind of ecological
Yeah, very
side
much,
to it,
yeah.
don't you think? There's
Yeah.
total thinking things through.
Yeah, but then why, we should ask her, but why John is so critical of him?
Because he reinstalls identity, it's still there.
You can see what, sorry?
Well, identity is still there, it's still reinstalled.
But how, I don't know, I mean, if you're talking about, say, see, again, it depends how you're situated within discourse. You know Lacan, again, so we crash into Lacan, you know, Lacan sets up these, says that there's these things different in different situations, discourses. So he sets up the discourse of the master, the university, the hysteric, and the analyzer. I don't know if you've come across this yet, where he has these basic positions, and if you, where you are, if you're the hysteric or the analyzer or the discourse university, the discourse changes to where, you know, in your relation to these things. So when you're talking about, Lauren, when you're talking about what were you talking about? When you were talking about event and this kind of thing, he's not on the same page. He's not talking on the same. He's not talking in the same way. So identity, you know, again, it matters from where your initial position is, because if for Lacan, an identity, you have a signifier, an authoritative something. It might be something in the unconscious. It might be an authoritative figure, something like this. The way the signifier is, it leads to a signifying chains. But to a schizophrenic, the signifying chains that give you an identity is a good thing. You know, identity can be a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. So it depends what you mean. Again, you problematise by an identity. We can think about the prevailing of what prevails within yourself as an identity. I answer to names and this, that. I drag my baggage with me. But is that not an identity?
Well, there's a sort of, there's things which are operative, but then it's different if you sort of make a ground with it. There's a difference between the, what was it,
Well,
the ungrounded,
the
groundless ground.
The only ground is the Descartes, who doubts everything except the fact that I exist.
Well, the thing is, he talks about fundamental attunement, so there's too much foundation too much foundation is getting.
Yeah,
but the foundation is big B being. It's not the foundation. And that is concealed, and that he doesn't offer anything there. Again, it goes back to the Lacanian real.
This oscillation between, I can't remember the two things he talks about, but it's the two, when he mentions the oscillation, but oscillation implies two terms, or two categories, or two...
Poles.
Yeah, possibly, and instead of being without criteria or something, or like the really the event, you're getting rid of that. So as soon as you sort of inflict an oscillation, perhaps. Well, I don't know, because that's a bit rough.
So I have a question
know.
here, which follows directly on from what Lon says. I mean, she says that the I has been reinstalled, and although he says
as the design.
Yeah, I mean, it says that the I itself becomes the foundation for all further questioning.
Yeah, but he's not talking about himself, he's describing a historical situation where metaphysics is now. He's not talking about his position.
Okay, right.
And if I
So
might go on, what he's saying, I can't quote where from, but is what he's saying about philosophy and logos, is that a rationalist approach like the one described here covers up everything. So we are thrown in this structuring or distribution of things based on certainty in this paradigm,
Yeah.
which covers up everything and silences everything. So we don't see. This is the light of the day we are in. The light of today, when he writes, is the certainty of the eye. Yeah. And as such, you cannot. No, this is the light of today. You cannot see beyond this light, beyond the dimensions of today. You cannot see beyond 3 dimensions of space plus time. That's our world. But that is where he's playing this game of concealing. This is what he's concealing. He's covering up something that has been it speaks about oblivion, all these very poetical words. Something else is that there isn't such solid certainty. There is a different kind of relationship between the instances of life, us, the present particles. I think it's very important to think in this way. The present particles of being and be, infinity, undetermined.
Yeah, we're finite beings, infinity.
Exactly. That has been somehow, these are not being, or the infinite being in itself, but the relationship has been silenced by a specific solidified paradigm.
Yeah.
And what is after
between
the two, between the present participle and the infinitive?
between being
Between Barnaby Adams and X.
and being.
Yes.
So between the finite and the infinite.
Yes. That has been silenced. Is the relationship has been silenced. This is the way I understand.
But who silenced it?
The very philosophy, very structure
So
of the
that's-
West.
Or by the
so-
idle chattel, by discourse, by language.
But the discourse of philosophy.
No, the discourse of metaphysics, i.e. the propositional
Discourse separating physics and
thinking.
metaphysics. So the fact that it starts by on thinking of the name metaphysics, where it comes from, it's accidental. The name metaphysics.
So, okay, but isn't he just then retreading a kind of Marxist perspective, which is religion, or metaphysics, i.e. religion, has been responsible for suppressing thought or existential thought. Isn't he just retreading that position?
Well, once
I mean,
again,
there's
it's the
nothing wrong
way,
with
the way
retreading
you,
that position.
it's the way you describe it. Yeah. I don't think he's just retreading the,
But is he not? Okay.
You see, there's a certain way that there's a certain manner about you, Barnaby.
Troublemaker.
Don't you think he's just retreading?
Okay.
You see, now, this speaks volumes about your world, because I don't speak this language. I'm not so cynical. Is it cynical? Is it?
I suspect it might be.
completely? Is it doubting? Is
It is doubting,
Yeah,
it
whatever
is
it is.
cynical, yes.
But this speaks volumes for your world and my world, which are not the same design. We're not fixing in the same way, but it's the way that you speak out about it that creates the whole mood, the tenor of your own. Don't you think that he's rehashing, let's say? Isn't he just plagiarising? It's veering off that direction, your language. But a different language, if I just said, don't you think he's in the same ballpark? What is a dreadful metaphor? Isn't he in the same ballpark? Isn't that my world?
No,
Right.
basically.
I don't like his world. Don't like his world. Yeah, he's in the same ballpark. But the language sets the direction, because attunement in German in this book is Stimmen, which has the word Stein voice in it. So it's like to go when the Bestimmen, go back to Heidegger when I first arrived there and stuff, the voice of the soul and orientation and direction of travel. That's in already. You can see that in the word Stimmen, Bestimmen, attunement, the voice, how you said it. You see. So you can see that how our worlds in the discourse create a direction of travel and an understanding, which is a world, two worlds, and at the same time, like your world, my world, and
Okay, let me
set
put it another way.
Yeah.
So incredibly, he's
You can't do it. You cannot do it. Go on, say it.
Someone hears the golden mellifluous tones of Marx in Heidegger's expressions of existential complaint.
Yeah.
But then he's revisiting in different ways, because
I don't wish to be like.
No.
It wasn't. I did insert a caveat at the end. I said it wasn't a bad argument.
No, this is the bit I was like, this is the
Yes,
he said,
Page.
well, this is why he's not getting rid of something.
page.
Oh. Like, it's after, page 2, I don't know, it's up, page 7, because that's good. He's,
Where?
page 6.
Which where?
Page 6.
Where?
Bit where he's talking about, like, he arrives up at the end of it saying, we name it finish.
Right. Yeah.
So he says, we ourselves,
Yeah.
ourselves are.
Mhm.
So, I mean, relates to the two is I think that Johnny would be saying. So here these are, it's referencing.
Yeah, but I think
kind
you're
of
being
things.
unfair.
But then
Page 6, yeah.
Page 6, halfway through the first paragraph.
Halfway
So-
through the first.
But you're being unfair
I can't
because.
finish the sentence.
We are
yet.
on the way.
Sorry, I thought you had. Sorry.
We ourselves are this.
Go, Laurie, go.
Yeah, so because I was picking up this bit from the oscillating earlier. So we ourselves are this underway. So this transition, so it's, this neither the one nor the other. What is this oscillating to and fro between this neither nor, not the one, and likewise not the other? This indeed, and yet not, and yet indeed. What is the unrest of this not? We name it finitude. So it sort of like touches, it brings in the event, but then at the same time it's still the claim that we ourselves are. Oh, it's perhaps not a good example.
This is
I'll just
Kierkegaardian
give the
trembling,
example
isn't
of what I didn't want to.
There is a similar move into that, yes.
I mean, that's perhaps an example of where he's bringing in the event in the liberate, perhaps in the liberatory sense, really, and the critical sense of the event, because the finite, I think, relates to the sort of like the Deleuzean aeon event in that sense, not the
I think
linearity
he means we
of
die.
progress.
That's what he means. What he means we die. We're finite.
Well, we die before we die. I think it means it more radically.
How do we die before we die?
Because we are, he said, we are ourselves this underway, this transition.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah.
But it sounds, it's an intuition, so I'm not sure I can articulate it, but precisely because we are in this transition, precisely because we are not the pure concept of either the only one or the infinity of being or even the infinity of the present participles, because we are constantly oscillating in between.
Which is the Heideggerian difference between being and being. Yeah.
Precisely because of that, there is finitude, or we are finite. Precisely because we are not the pure abstract concept which persists forever.
Yeah.
We are finite.
Yeah.
But this is. I mean, oscillation is very specific. You oscillate, or something oscillates between two polarities, and in between with those two polarities, you have a closed system. You have something in perpetual movement, but it's not perpetually moving anywhere. It's only perpetually moving in between two points, and that's its finitude. It's its closed system.
But also there are
It's like a sound wave.
The trouble is the language. From the way I hear the language, it's thinking of being belong together in the same, belonging together. Is two together. What you're saying, the description of a logic, of an oscillation, somehow the language is tending towards an understanding which is far too rigid, as it were. The understanding is too certain, as it were. The pictures, the images, the oscillation, and the event of this moving back and forth, that's what's grabbed your mind. It's the images.
But don't forget, an oscillation, or the term to oscillate, is a very good example of a non-representational way of thinking, because although I've said an oscillation, something in oscillation, like a sound wave, for instance, is very, very difficult to visually represent. Now, all I've stated are parameters within which, because it's subject to the category of finitude, there is oscillation between these two things. But I'm not actually representing anything, and I'm not referring to a representational way of thinking, because at any point in time, that which oscillates is in an indefined place.
I think this is where you can bring Leotard in, the discourse figure back in, because I think there's a visual aspect to it. There's a visual, figurative side, which itself points to a certain kind of logic and a certain kind of understanding. I think there's something in that that's going on in the language itself. The language itself of oscillation, and the example itself, is coming out of a linguistic tradition or understanding that he would want to problematize somehow and change the language of what you're saying. So not oscillate, but something else.
Would it help to think of gravity as an example?
Not really, but carry on.
Well, you say not really. I don't want to know the
He
idea.
mentions gravity in the
But
sentence
the
before.
idea that gravity does not exist by itself, and a single body does not experience or produce gravity, you need two particles, two bodies, two planets, whatever you want them to be, to have gravity. And as soon as they are, the gravity is there, and vice versa. As soon as gravity is there, they are. But energy is pulled down into matter. This kind of thing, I believe, is more oscillation. Is more what is happening here. That's it. Can
Well, again, but it's the language. You know, the language seems to be coming from somewhere else, doesn't it? Our examples, you know, try to explain it. This is why it was always going to go wrong and astray. The examples themselves somehow.
No, but
take
I
us
believe that's what
away.
we say. We have to stay with his play of words, and
Yeah.
we have to stay with him being essence, Wesen and Wesen, Sungen, whatever else. There's funny words in German. If you in the it's the footnotes of these books about the translations are amazing because they are far more telling than the text itself, I think. Question concerning technology, question 1 to the first word on the page. It says, essence is the traditional translation of the German noun Wesen. One of Heidegger's principal aims in this essay is to seek the true meaning of essence, through or by way of correct meaning. He will later show that Wesen does not simply mean what something is, but what it means. Further, the way in which something pursues its course, the way in which it remains through time as what it is. Heidegger writes elsewhere that the noun Wesen does not mean quiditas originally, quiditas quick, not somethingness, so to speak, that's Latin, but rather enduring as presence. And then he goes on. Wesen as a noun derives from the verb wesen, which is seldom used as such in modern German. The verb survives primarily in inflected forms of the verb sein, to be, and in such words as the adjective anwesend, present. It's now what is not enduring, the cut of them. The old verbal forms from which wesen stems meant to tarry or dwell. Heidegger repeatedly identified wesen as the same as wahan, to last or endure. As a verb, wesen was usually translated blah blah blah, translated to come to presence, a rendering wherein the meaning endure should be strongly heard, and so forth. So this is the material Heidegger is using.
Temporal material.
But in language, this is why he's saying that the relation of belonging is to be found in language. The language is the house of being.
But I think this is perhaps in terms of what we're going on, in future weeks to speak about. I mean, I think this is one of what Lauren said is very interesting. First of all, the oscillation. I mean, this is cannot happen unless it's a temporal, a temporal construct. But more interesting.
The oscillation
between this neither nor. I mean, I'm still looking at it's 6.
Yeah.
What is this oscillating? But the point of finitude, it says it is not some property that is merely attached to us, but is our fundamental way of being. And I think this is perhaps an answer to the question, like what annoys Johnny about Heidegger is this notion. Surely it's this sense of individuation, this sense of I, which is finite.
Yes, but it is also. I have the impression that it is somehow addressing the notion of mediation that exists in Hegel. That you know much better than
It exists in
Hegel, which always needs. No, I am for myself. That is, I need the outside in order to fully constitute myself. And the outside is that Geschichte, the thrown off, the rejected, the anti-me. And here instead, you can make this difference. there is a disposition of the two, but this is why I brought up gravity, but it only exists in the combination. Am I correct in this, or I am distorting both?
No, I kind of grasp
No,
what you
no,
said, yeah.
It's interesting. You only become finite in you can only recognise your finitude when you're recognising in terms of the something else.
No.
I mean, you're only
I don't
subject to gravity if you're falling towards a very large body.
I mean, I'm not trying to explain something I know for sure. I'm just trying to understand it while I am talking. But, I think there is more to do with the fact that the oscillation is finite because it's the oscillation within one field in one moment with a given number of participants. Another present would have another kind of finitude because it would have different dimensions. When I say different dimensions, not different. All the people would be here today, the conversation would have been different. In this sense, it is finite. Does that make sense?
So it doesn't really describe oscillation. I mean, I think this oscillation is very interesting because it kind of offers, it charts finitude, but it also offers instability because your pitch or the number of times per second the whatever it is oscillating is the pitch. And that can be very unstable, in the same way as you could hear it. I mean, these are things which are not representational descriptions of something. I mean, yeah, you could say, well, all right, it's a scanner. It's a scanner of an oscillator. I can't remember what the technical term is for the
Oscillator scanner. Yeah.
It's just an oscillator. But even those are fictitious representative images of that which isn't representable. They're kind of second order representations of sound waves, for instance. If you've ever looked at pits of sound waves.
Going back to the example of gravity, there is an argument according to which we are as big as we are because matter could not support the weight of our bodies if we were 3 or 4 meters high. So on the planets as they are, at least on this planet, given the mass of the Earth and the attraction it exercises over bodies, we can only be up to 1 meter 80 meters. Other than that, it wouldn't work. This is the oscillation. This is why I mentioned that.
Yeah, big being, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
And not because we could be a big being, and it's the two are together. You can apart they don't exist.
I still think you're thinking about gravity, which I think is really interesting because I think it's this kind of interior exterior. The finitude describes it. I mean, I think it sets up a problem. In that paragraph, it sets up the problem of the next 50 years or 60 years, which is kind of postmodern theories of the self, and the question of finitude. I mean, Charlie, you notice my tone is modulating here, but I find this to be the question. It's like within kind of heterogeneity and postmodern theory, where the self is described as, if not infinite, then kind of porous, should we say. Although I don't want to kind of anachronistically sort of criticise it, although he's problematizing the concept of self and staying it and destabilizing it, what he hasn't quite got is that it's closed. And now it might be closed in relation to a much kind of larger metaphysical concern, which he's not particularly.
You would say he was open, that the Dasein is open to being.
No, I think that the Dasein is in relation to being. which is not quite the same thing as being.
But then he would say then that you're doing exactly what everyone else does, which is mistake being for beings, or you articulate being in terms of beings, straight back into metaphysics. The problem to get out of metaphysics is to articulate or to head towards or to understand or to be illuminated or stand out in the light of big B being, but what you're doing is dragging it back in and making it into metaphysics again.
And I think that's precisely the problem with Heidegger. Or not the problem with Heidegger, I don't want to say, that's not criticism, but that's precisely the field of criticism with Heidegger. It's like he would like to get out of metaphysics, and he's proposing a kind of a way of doing it, but at the same time is not successful. Which I think even he would have joined in that criticism.
He says we're underway to this, and then in brackets as a whole. But is this whole the differently whole that Johnny talks about? I don't think it probably is. I don't know.
The different.
Well, she talks about a differently whole, which is like the sort of radically a more radical whole, in that the new can come from it in an irreducible kind of way.
The
and pure becoming is potential. I mean, I think like the event that relates to pure becoming, I'm not sure whether it.
Finitude implies a whole, doesn't it? You know, with a W in the front of it.
I was thinking, how does this sort of finitude here relate to this continuity? I'm expecting that it does. This.
It's finitude because it's a problem. Finitude must be taken as problematic in this sense. We know we're finite. We know we die. We know we cannot do a number of things.
Materially, you're talking about.
Even mentally, we know we cannot. No, there are limits to our.
But that's what I was saying. Reject limits. Reject all these limits. We're not bounded.
But the thing is,
the
question.
Bounded, I think no, but we are not infinite. I mean, there was a fantastic comment when Stein came to us the second time. An instrument is a set of limitations. When the guy was building those finitely told wires and the things and the dials, and so that for me brought together so many things that I think about art. There is no point in wanting to use a tool as a neutral vehicle to represent the meaning. You play with what you have, and you do that which what you have allows you to do. That's finitude. And this is exactly what happens in this tension between two, maybe abstract poles, I don't know. It's almost not important, I think. It is the way these two things are intertwined that is important, and that's the present, it's us, and that it is only finite. It is one of the probably endless options of limitations.
And also, the questioning shows a way. He's not giving us solutions or answers. He's not over-answering the question. He's presenting questions. For him, questions are very important. Questioning shows the way. So what is finitude? What is solitude? What is individuation? What is world? He keeps as you say, he keeps asking these questions and then coming back to them in different ways, you know, in different books and different understanding. So it's not. This is not like there's no answer. He says at the end of this, it's just he leaves it all up in the air still at the end of this section. He doesn't answer to the question, but the point of the question is that the question inserts the questioner into it inserts the questioner. It's a comprehensive question. It inserts the questioner into the totality of being, which is what he's talking about, because he's talking about metaphysics from the point of a metaphysician. And he's saying, what is world? My world, your world, all worlds. It's finitude, solitude. And he's inserting himself into the question. You've inserted yourself, and you've inserted yourself into the question. You come up with different answers. I don't think he cares about that, the fact that you've got different answers. It's just the fact that the question goes in that way, and the question gets asked. And then all the other questions, what is technology, what is called thinking, these kind of things. So questioning is the way, as he says, and the way is very, that statement, the way, is a kind of mission statement for Heidegger. where we set out on on the path, that kind of language.
You give an
Without-
example of the
without
instrument
coming-
making. Let's just like come back. You sort of said like setting up the limits of making an instrument, but I didn't mean limits.
An instrument
in
is a
that
set
way.
of limitations or a
No,
set of
can I just
dimensions.
respond to that? I mean, what I wanted to say is like it's the outcome, the event from the play or the work of art,
Mhm.
not the object of art, or the equating to the instrument with its limitations of this, that, or the other. It's what's important or critical is the work of art as the event, and that draws upon the boundless. That's where there's no limits.
But isn't there?
Potentially, I want to
No, I
say
don't know
there's
if I understand
this
what you're saying.
boundless, there's this freedom.
When I speak of a work of art, it doesn't have to be a material object, and an instrument doesn't have a material instrument. It can be an apparatus, it can be a system, a set of laws, it doesn't matter.
But
Just look at the problems of translating. Obviously, German and English don't do the same thing.
No, she's not saying that though.
Then I don't get it.
Well, when I thought you were describing like just the making of it, I was imagining an instrument, saying I tried to make an instrument myself, and I said I was only going to allow myself to use paper and like a rubber, and I was going to make an instrument out of that. I sort of set myself two limitations in that sense, and I wanted to say the limitations I was talking about wasn't about the rules of sort of in that sense. It was about the sense of an event of what happens in terms of there being the possibility of something happen which isn't reducible to causes, and so it's like the impossible coming from the possible, and it's that which to me is like a much more critical kind of event, and what he's kind of putting on the table, but then he's sort of enclosing it again, I think, like you're saying.
Well, I suppose you could say that a finitude is an instrument, and therefore could be seen as a question in itself because it's closed. You know, and we know that depending on the question results the answer. You know, that's what we're talking about here. Restricting your palate, you know, to a certain kind of instrument doesn't necessarily restrict. Well, it restricts the kind of answer you would like to get or the work you would like to produce, but it doesn't necessarily restrict its quality. It just changes the course of the, you know, if you say, well, I'm going to make a work of art and I'm going to use anything I want to, well, you know, you're going to have a very different outcome to say, well, I'm only going to use a piece of paper and a rubber.
Also, if you say I want to,
doesn't mean say you're going to have doesn't mean to say it could be that the restrictions.
if you say anything I want to use, then you will never do anything. You never get to do, you know, the result will be nothing, because you will be in front of an endless array of possibilities, none of which will become concrete. The work of art will never take place.
Well, I don't
Will
agree
never
with that.
come to pass, as it says. And then at a certain point you're there bored, and the other big element of Heidegger, because you've got all these options open, and finally you start playing with this pen in a way or another, and it becomes something you tap with and make a rhythm and becomes a musical instrument, or make a drawing, or stick it in your ear and do a performance, and immediately you narrow down the possibilities, and they become dimensions of that specific event. This is indeed the way in which I see finitude, after all the things we've said. Maybe it's not sorry.
But do you think so? Finitude as being a question?
I haven't got any real.
Because the question is closed, is it not?
No, what is it? It's asking what are limits? What are limits? What is finitude? What are the limits? Yeah. So.
Listen to what is Brian here. Questioning builds the way. We would be advised, therefore, above all, to pay heed to the way and not to fix our attention on isolated sentences and topics.
Which is what we're doing.
The way is a way of thinking. All ways of thinking, more or less perceptibly, lead through language in a manner that is extraordinary. We shall be questioning concerning technology, and in so doing, we should like to prepare a free relationship to it. Now, we can replace technology with something else, but is the way of is the way we do it.
Well, if you change technology to techna and think of techna as a way that reveals being in a being,
Yeah, because obviously the game of Heidegger is a way to reveal being, but which way you get that, or whichever
reveal
is
beings in their being.
Um,
Yeah.
So that I think is, and then he goes on and says, he says the relationship will be free if it opens our human existence to the essence of technology. When we can respond to this essence, we shall be able to experience the technological within its own bounds, which might respond to the idea of finitude.
Which means?
Well, that the finitude is the fact that it happens within that relationship and does not have an abstract existence. That's to me is what finitude is.
I was thinking when you sort of said finitude, finitude is like, I was imagining that as a sort of, you know, when you sort of replace one word to try and understand more speeches that I was sort of thinking, when you name it ending, so I was thinking of like passing, because he's totally is, he was a
Passing like filtering.
Well, he says of that
You
fundamental.
mean like passing like filtering, P-A-R-S-I-N-G?
No, actually meant just P-A-S-S.
Oh, okay.
In relation to fundamental attunement, he says, refers to a self-temporalizing. So, I don't know, so I thought this, what is the unrest of this not, you know, finitude? So it's like this sort of constancy of an end, a constancy in play of an ending, so it's like an active ending, you know, which could be a becoming, but he is using, well, I was wondering whether that's, he was supposed to take it, no. We don't know.
Let me ask